as I was saying in the last part, in many cases, the only other has been lost, or the good other has never been there. And as life goes, probably it's not going to be there either. And in this situation, there are three things that come up, three options that come up. Situation one, somebody is oriented spiritually, in which case this is a welcome development, it's a liberation. The person is sort of released from the social shackles, so to say. So the shackles have gone off if the spiritual aspect of life is active in him. And he is able to pursue better the inner development, the inner journey in a spiritual sense. Such a second situation where the existential part of life has become active in the man. What you see in the existential philosophers, that they keep talking about the absurd, about anguish, about sadness, about death, about despair, all their lives, but they don't commit suicide. Their readers who read their books commit suicides, but they don't commit suicides. And in their life, you can also see that they are living despite all the expressions of sadness, of pessimism, of despondency. They are living a reasonably good life. And in some corner of the life, there is intensity, positivity, and celebration. There may not be an acknowledgement or expression of it, but it is there. You can see it. Actions speak louder than words. You can see it there. So in such cases, what happens is there is a existential state which has become active in those people. And there is a kind of a very deep, tragic, but a sweet melancholy. And this sweet melancholy is what keeps them going, keeps them motivated. So even though they talk about despair, helplessness, and so on, they keep writing books after books. They are motivated enough to write a book about demotivation. So in action, whatever words they use, in action we see that they are motivated to do things. They are motivated even to advance the cause that one should not be motivated, it's futile to be motivated. For that you need motivation.
Yes.
To establish it in society, that is futile to be motivated. So actions speak louder than words. The unconscious motivations are quite different from what is consciously spoken and done. And we see in them a sweet melancholy, a sweet flame deep inside them which propels them. So they sort of prosper in this gloom. So that is the second group of people. The third group of people is the most tragic that we were referring to, where there is no spiritual or existential state which is active inside, and they get into a state, what we said, what is left after the last hope has left. And they either never had a good object, nor will they have one, or they had once but are never going to have it again. Some never had any stable object whatsoever and are never going to have it. And there we have to leave it to them. If they wish to continue to live and explore life and hope, or they wish to gracefully go. And if they wish to gracefully go, we should empower them with rights to make it a peaceful, graceful, and a productive death, and not hold on to that fanatic belief of continuing human life at any cost, because the cost here is too great. So these are some of the things which come up in the context of very deep-seated object losses or tragedies with the object, the burden of which one carries on one's shoulders for a long time, at times even till death.
So does spirituality freeze one from the other?
It does. Only if an existential or spiritual part is activated in the person who is facing from the tragedy, suffering the tragedy of the other in some way, or of the self in some way. The 2 points of our discussion, the difficult self and the difficult other, and the difficult in between. So only if some spiritual part is active in the person, it becomes very easy. In spirituality, contrast to psychoanalysis, many states of disintegration, of anxiety, of loneliness are seen as intermediate states in the journey towards a spiritual solution, a spiritual resolution of something deep inside. So they don't look at these states as avoidable states, as pathological states to be overcome. Rather, they live it through. And this is a very different approach. Instead of fighting those states, instead of having a split opinion about those states, of those states being all bad and the normal states being all good, instead of that, patiently and openly and positively live those states out to the last drop that there is to savor or suffer. And this is not only a approach to these difficult states, but many of these states are actually thought to be necessary in the inner journey. Like some states of annihilation anxiety, fragmentation anxiety, of disintegration of the ego, they are believed to be very natural states in many of the Buddhist meditations. That as you go deeper, you inevitably encounter the states of disintegration or states of annihilation anxiety, the states of fragmentation. And they are actually seen as intermediate goals, intermediate achievements of the spiritual process. So instead of problems, they are achievements, in the sense you have gone deep enough to actually experience them. No, everybody doesn't experience them. And obviously there is a difference. When you experience those states after going deep into meditation, it's one situation. And without doing anything, those states fall upon your head, it's quite a different situation.
Indeed.
Obviously, every pathological situation is not a situation of spiritual progress. Here we are talking about somebody following the process and through that process landing into these states, which if they occur on their own are severe pathological states, which is quite different. So
Yes.
the approach is different. Many times they search for this state so that they can consolidate better as they resolve these states. There are exercises, for example, in the tantric path, there is a very important approach of the Mahavidya. One of the Mahavidyas is Chinnamasta. And in the sadhana of Chinnamasta, practice of Chinnamasta, one of the core tasks to be done is transcendence of the self. And this often starts with disintegration of the self. That the I has to be given up and the doership of that I has to be given. So the system remains.
So you dissolve the I first.
Sorry?
So you dissolve the I first. The self is dissolved.
Yeah. And it happens in 2-3 ways. One is the I identifies with the deity and one believes that all that one is doing is the deity doing. That's a preparatory exercise. Sorry?
Kind of fusion or amalgamation?
Yeah, it's a very conscious productive fusion. It's a part of certain evolutionary, I would say, as a part of certain developmental processes.
A desired effect.
Yeah. And this brings us to a very important point, that the pathological states, if they are approached spiritually in limited intensity for a limited purpose, then per se, these states are not ab initio pathological. So the same pathological states can be experienced at a lower intensity with clear beginning and clear end in the spiritual journey also. So the states per se are not pathological if they inflict upon the person themselves, if they explode out from inside without the person doing anything and then make the person helpless in front of them and make life difficult, then they become pathological. But in the spiritual quest, if you search out or you stumble into these states, they are more a part of the spiritual process rather than the pathological process.
Can it be partial of both? At times, a person is spiritually inclined, and then the journey of life takes a part of pathology into this direction, because then when there is this pathological version, it is going to seek relief outside, and then there is a congruence in both the stages, and from there they take over.
Yeah, that is more often the case, that the person with a spiritual opening also has a pathology to deal with, and the necessary
evils to deal with.
The necessary element for this kind of situation is that the person has knowledge of and is open to both psychoanalysis and spirituality.
So the pathology becomes a catalyst to the entire process.
Yes, yes. But the necessary condition is to be open to both and be honest about it. Otherwise, the danger is that one can pass off one's pathology as a spiritual thing.
Absolutely.
Or not use the tools of psychotherapy which are essential to deal with certain kinds of pathologies, which are very difficult to deal with from a spiritual point. So it's very necessary that we don't use spirituality as a defense, and we accept pathology as a pathology and deal with it, also acknowledging that the pathology may have a purpose. And had it not been for this pathology, probably so much of intellectual and spiritual development could not have happened, and one would have taken a very different path of life. So the pathology can be itself very valuable in that sense. It's not something of 100% evil to be fought and discarded. And there's also another thing that often people say in spirituality, that your worst difficulty is the source of your most potential greatness. So the person who is most anxious can become the most fearless. But that, of course, has many ifs and buts, conditions applied on the way.
True.
So in Chinnamasta offers, as we were saying, the I can identify with another omnipotent I and believe that the omnipotent I is working through him. And this is like a very healthy belief. It's almost like we are inviting a psychosis. So without the psychotic process, we are inviting something which is akin to psychosis, but it's not psychosis. And
very close to what Ramakrishna Paramhansa appeared to many,
right,
who were not in touch with spirituality.
Correct. So the first is the transcendence of I is by identification with a greater I. And then the next part, and the more important part, is the unorganizing of I. And this is a very important word, because unorganizing is very different from disintegration.
Okay.
So Winnicott uses these words: organizing, organizing, unorganizing, disorganizing, and disintegration.
Mm-hmm.
So unorganizing is, for example, let us say you want to do something productive with fantasy. Either you want to enjoy a movie or you want to create a work of art. This cannot happen with the ego in the front, the reality principle in the front. You have to allow the ego to take the backstage and allow the fantasy part of it with a purpose given to it and faculties provided at its service to really roll out something. So if you are sitting in a movie, if unless you suspend the reality function, you can't enjoy the movie. Because you know everybody is paid to do what he is doing. Everything is fake. Nothing is real. It's a show put up. If that is in the front of the mind, there is no way you can enjoy a fantasy. So the reality function has to be suspended, or if not suspended, at least deactivated and put on the backstage for the fantasy to be enjoyed. And that is true for all areas of life, including doing something productive and creative. Not always productive, but definitely creative. Now, this is where the unorganizing of the ego happens, that the ego is either deactivated or it is put aside.
Okay.
But it is not disintegrating. It is not creating the anxiety of disintegration. It is not creating the split processes of disintegration. It is not creating the annihilatory anxiety or the merger anxieties of disintegration. It is like, for example, when we are at this moment involved in something deeply intellectual, the lower centers are switched off. They are not disintegrated or destroyed. They go into the background. Yeah. So similarly, the I, the ego, the social self, so to say, not the system ego, but the social self, that is unorganized and
Consciously
unorganized. Consciously, consciously one thinks about it. Consciously one thinks about it, but until the unconscious system is ready, it does not happen. So obviously it requires, it cannot be just willed. The will is there, but the will has to be allowed to come true by the consent of the unconscious and the capacity of the unconscious.
It's not a default.
Yeah.
There has to be an act out will.
It is not the type of will where I say, after half an hour, I will have coffee and nobody can stop me from having coffee. It's not that kind of exercise of a will. It's a conditional exercise of the will. That the will can will itself, but the consent has to come from the unconscious. That will come only if the unconscious is ready and capable. And that takes quite a preparation. What we call the sadhana. And then the whole thing comes about of the annihilation of the social self.
Okay.
The biological self remains, the involuntary unconscious self remains, but the social self is annihilated. And this is the practice of Chinnamasta, where the depiction in the iconography is that you have cut off your own head. So you have cut off your own eye. And out of that, in the iconography, 3 streams of blood are going out. So they are the roots of your desire in the form attached to I. And
so when you say the self is annihilated and the other is, it's like a shroud you take over on the dead self. That reminds me the spiritual personality Mirabai.
right. Right.
Because somewhere she had dissolved the social self and I don't know the right word. She had become the other itself in her living.
Right. So brings up a very interesting area that you have referred to. It's a very good example you have brought in. The path of surrender is one path to transcend the self by disorganizing it. And the disorganizing, when it becomes perpetual, it's a spiritual annihilation. The few people on that path would be able to achieve a complete transcendence of the social self.
Right.
So more likely, I'm not saying anything about Mira in particular, but I'm just making a general comment that on that path of surrender, more likely is a situation where 2/3 of the social self is overcome, transcended by surrender.
Okay.
And the peace which comes from the peace which comes from deep meditative states. But there is a danger of the social self being there in many of the social interactions. Meaning, it's very difficult to be in ecstasy 24/7. So when the states of ecstasy goes, and you are in a stable everyday situation, and let us say you are meeting with your relatives or your friends, and they say something and ask you to do something, the social self can activate. I'm not saying it cannot be transcended, it can be, but the chances are it will activate again and it will need again your attention to address it. But in the Chinnamasta practice, it's very meticulous. It's very meticulous and very to the root. So the practice is so intense and deep and so difficult that the chances of something unresolved remaining are less. I'm not saying it cannot happen. Of course it can happen. But the chances are less. So here what we look at is the problems of the other are overcome by transcendence of the self. The other is not changed. The self undergoes a radical change because the self moves from a state of object relations to a state of object freedom. And second stage, the self moves from identity with oneself to identity with existence. And therefore, the self is now merged with the existence. And the individual self, therefore, is exhausted. So there is a biological self that remains.
Right.
There is a psychological, unconscious self that will remain. But apart from these two coordinators, there is no social self, a becoming self, or a relating self that remains. And therefore, what you see at the end of it is a free system, free from I and free from the other, but the system is still subject only to the laws of survival and ordinary everyday function. Upon this system, when the will to do something is put in by existence from inside or outside, this system then works for that purpose without the doership or identification with what is happening or the results of it. So it's a very different solution to the problem of the self and the other, and a very different approach to the solution of the self and the other.
So can we say that in Sanatan Dharma, when we talk about the union, getting rid of the duality, the Advaita, this is where the I is dissolved and the other has been merged with, right? While in Buddhism, the other does not exist. I become the desired other, something of that sort.
Yeah, the difference will be this.
This is to my understanding that, yes.
This we are entering into the state, we are entering a discussion of the various descriptions of the states of enlightenment.
Of course, but I'm still thinking in terms of this I and other in spiritual context.
Correct. So it's we have discussed this states of enlightenment in one of our discussions on effective enlightenment.
I was fortunate enough to be there on the other side of receiving.
So let's put that in this context of the self and the other. It's very interesting what you have brought up. In the Advaita scheme of things, there are two experiences which are described. One is the self dissolves into the Brahman. And the second, the self sees itself propelled out to the others.
Okay.
So there are two experiences. One, where the other is cancelled in experience, not in reality. Of course, other exists. In those states, you don't experience any other, but only one Brahman. One oceanic experience, that's it. And in the second state, you experience the oneness with the Brahman, but you see the Brahman extended into the other. So the other is connected to the self, but there is conscious awareness that I may not have the awareness of the other as being the other, but the other as it. I might see him as a part of one oceanic whole. He doesn't see it that way. Of that I am. Whereas in the first experience, you don't bother about the other. It is just to see yourself in an oceanic state extended into everything that exists. And in the deepest states of ecstasy, you only are completely lost into that state, and there is no awareness of anything else. But there is a feeling of a completeness, a filling up of some void inside. In the Buddhist realm, it is the all-negating absolute. So the deepest feeling there of nirvana is that the other is an illusion, does not exist anymore. The self is an illusion, does not exist anymore. And there is nothing but an all-negating void. So there is this experience of nothingness. The self and the other both are annihilated in that experience.
And also, this is how they have created their meditation, each dharma we're talking about. Their meditation is more into going into the nothingness, while there is in Sanatana, it is seeing everything as the other, including yourself. So there is no I and there is no other, but yet the other is omnipotent, expansive.
Correct. And in certain schools, like for that of Sri Aurobindo, the all-negating absolute is a state from which one goes further into other states where the temporal becomes significant. Like if you look at two different fundamental differences in the spiritual schools, one is there are schools of liberation which say that this world can never be changed, just get out of it through nirvana, of some sort of liberation. The Jains would call it Kevalya, the Buddhists will call it nirvana, but some sort of liberation, you eject out of this existence, this ordinary existence of world. Okay? And the second is where you participate in the world. So Osho calls it the path of no and the path of yes. Sri Aurobindo calls it the path of liberation and the path of transformation. Now, one of the core philosophical differences is this, that the path of liberation does not think that the temporal is significant.
Okay.
That everything is temporary and ultimately everything in the universe will be destroyed.
Destroyed eventually.
It will go away. Everything will pass away. Nothing will stay forever. So whatever you do, whatever the results of it, it's all insignificant. It seems significant to you because of your time scale.
Exactly.
And
fair enough.
Your feelings and your thoughts. But if you think on a grander scale, the solar system will go away, with that the earth, and with that everything you have created. So everything is temporal and therefore insignificant. Whereas the path of the yes says that there is significance of the temporal.
So does that mean it is signifying absoluteness into entire context?
The temporal events are deemed to be significant in the path of the yes. That even if I know that the solar system will end and the earth will end and all the good I do will end, I still find it worthwhile to do the good. I still see value in it.
Okay.
Like if I give food to the hungry, I see value in that temporal activity. Although I know someday the solar system will go away. But I see value in the temporal. I don't dismiss the temporal because of its temporality.
Okay.
The value of the temporal does not cease because of its temporality. I believe the temporal is significant. So this is how the two diverge, that the path of the no believes the temporal is insignificant. And since everything is temporal, everything is insignificant. So one outcome of this is in the spiritual path, especially or even on the Chinnamasta sadhana, the problems of self and the other are dealt with in a way that there are no issues for an individual in terms of being alone, because there is nobody to be alone there.
Right.
It's a very different solution to loneliness. Nobody can, you are not alone because, yeah, you are not alone because there's nobody to be alone. In fact, you cannot be alone. That is a kind of approach and the situation.
To be alone, you have to be there.
Yes.
And that's not possible.
Yeah, once you dissolve the self into existence in the way that they talk about, there's no one there to be alone, so you cannot be alone.
Beautiful.
So the cessation of I is something, and this goes deeper. Some even go to the cessation of identification with the biological I. But those are rare mistakes. Most of them, most of the enlightened people and the states they live are the cessation of the relating social self, the becoming self.
True. Wow. So insightful, enriching, rewarding, yet complex, mystic. That is very much deeply revealing as well at the same time. Hope our viewers have found some beautiful meaning and understanding to it. Thank you so much, Dr. Himanshu Vaidya. See you all again. Namaste.
Namaste.